For those of you that have been watching this particular channel for quite some time, you know that the majority of the time I'm usually in a car shooting these videos. And you notice there's two cars that I would usually use. One is an older model, which is this one, and then the other one is a newer model, a 22. Now, what's significant about that in retrospect to what I'm about to talk to you about in terms of Khamzat and Tyson Fury? Stay with me for a second, because there's a point to this, and I always have a point to whatever it is I'm trying to explain to you. So, the reason why I have a 2016 model and why I decided to keep it even after getting a 22, let's just be honest. 2016s have a CD player and the newer models don't. I don't know when they stopped using the CD player system in the cars. I don't know if it was somewhere in 2017, 18, maybe somewhere around that time frame. But if you buy a newer car, 22, 23, 24, and beyond, you're just not going to have a CD player. Now, does that make it better, or does that make it different, or does that make it unique for its particular moment of time in history? Now you see where a lot of this is going in terms of what I'm about to explain to you. Tyson Fury went in there as an experienced fighter against a novice, not even a novice, a debutant. And by the way, we can argue about the notion of whether Francis has been in real fights or not. The fact of the matter is, you can't deny MMA as a combat sport and as some kind of experience in using your hands in an unarmed combat situation, especially when you go in a sport that literally requires you to do one thing, and that's to use your hands in an unarmed situation and then get points and rewarded for it, and even win as the victor if, let's say, you come out and knock out and finish your opponent. Well, obviously, none of those things happen. Now, what about Khamzat? Here's Khamzat, a guy who is least experienced, but in the opposite end, fighting someone like Kamaru Usman, who is the veteran, the former champion, the guy that's literally on his way down as Khamzat is on his way up. So why is this significant? Let's go back to the boxing side of this particular argument. There's this common notion that a lot of people always go about saying, you know what? Boxing ain't what it used to be anymore. Boxing ain't what it used to be. I have a couple of theories on that. For one, the reason why you often hear this is probably because of the fact that, let's just face it, a lot of people that say this have a 90s nostalgia of the days of Lennox Lewis, Mike Tyson, and the names that you can go back in the list, Evander Holyfield. Those were the days when, let's just be honest about it, African Americans were dominating boxing. And nowadays, you look at the modern landscape of boxing, you could say that the British guys are sort of running the scene, at least in a heavyweight division. You look at the top heavyweights in boxing right now, damn near all of them are British. So, no wonder a lot of people are saying boxing ain't what it used to be. You look at the English fans in boxing, every week they turn up. It's like a never-ending party. And then on top of that, they celebrate their boxing events. Whereas here in the United States, the only boxing event we would really care about are the ones with the big names, or the ones that have an influential social media angle to it, i.e. influencers, YouTubers, TikTokers, and all these people that have beef with each other online and decided they want to go settle it in the ring. That's basically the modern legacy of American boxing as we know it today. And who is the utmost leader of that particular concept? None other than Jake Paul. Obviously, he's not the one that created the concept, but nonetheless, he's the ever-leading man in that particular stratosphere of influential boxing and whatnot. So now, going back to this subject, what I mentioned about the 2016 as opposed to having a 2022 car, right? The 2016 has a CD player. The 22 doesn't. Tyson Fury has some flaws that the last undisputed champion of Britain never had. Now, at the same time, Tyson Fury's never lost in ways that Lennox Lewis has. However, Lennox Lewis avenged all of his losses in the same similar fashion that George St. Pierre avenged all of his losses and never took a loss since and beat every man that he's been in there with, which is why I compare GSP as literally the Lennox Lewis of MMA and Lennox Lewis as the GSP of boxing. So, something to think about. Now, one era has contrasting differences of what it is that they go through and the challenges that they face. I don't think Lennox Lewis has ever in his entire life that he would imagine to have ever fight, let's say, somebody from a different discipline. Even if kickboxing was big, or let's say, hypothetically, kickboxing was big in the 1980s and 90s, and there was, let's say, one figure in the heavyweight division that we all want to see scrap it out with the heavyweight champ of boxing, right? He would have never imagined dealing with anybody like that, let alone, let's say, YouTubers or actors or anything of that nature. Because the 90s back then, they were just all so above something like that. Whereas in the modern world and everything that we see today, it's like as if anything goes, anything can happen, and anything will happen. Now, you look at Khamzat Chimaev. Let's compare him to the past predecessors of the past, in particular George St. Pierre. Now, once again, Khamzat Chimaev is undefeated. George St. Pierre is not. And why am I comparing Khamzat Chimaev to George St. Pierre? Well, let's just face it. He encompasses the two weight classes that GSP has dominated in some kind of way. Obviously, multiple title defenses at 170, winning the middleweight champion one time and then vacating it just for the sake of saying that he went in there and won his second title and then riding off into the sunset once again, victorious in his original position, retiring as a 170-pound division champion. Now, what is better between Khamzat and George St. Pierre? Because we're talking about new models versus old models. Just because one model has one thing that the older model doesn't have, or if the newer model has some things that, or doesn't have things that the older model has, it doesn't make it any better or worse. And by the way, by the end of it all, it is just all about subjective opinions upon subjective opinions, nothing objective. And by the way, speaking of George St. Pierre, one of the most compelling arguments that he's ever made, being that unarguably, he's one of the best fighters of all time, if not the greatest, just based on the statistics, based on the fact that he's beaten everybody that's in front of him, based on the fact that he's never got caught up with drugs or anything of that nature. Very important to understand. So, yes, we can say he is the greatest of all time in that, but he also said that there is no such thing as the greatest of all time. It's a made-up concept. It's a concept that, like what I just said a couple of seconds ago, literally subjective. It is a subjective opinion, not an objective fact. Because if you want to talk objectivity, Khamzat has yet to win a world title. George St. Pierre, on the other hand, has won multiple titles. Now, does that make him better than George St. Pierre? Now, by looking at the two guys, the one thing that you can really understand and look at is that Khamzat just seems to look like a naturally stronger fighter. Now, George St. Pierre, don't get me wrong, is a very strong fighter. You look at all the training videos that he's done, it's very similar to what George St. Pierre has done, right? It's, by the way, you look at some of my training videos that I did for MMA conditioning. If you look on the video section below, probably about 3 months ago, you'll see I do the same similar workouts, right? These workouts are literally designed to help you become stronger in clinch positions, to be stronger in wrestling exchanges, to have incredible knockout power in terms of being able to have that extra torque in your hips and in your legs in order to generate the power from the ground. So these are important matters to take a look at in understanding training methods that have always worked, right? So these are not anything new. The Russians have been using this same particular system, or what you would call, let's say, the CrossFit system, whereas American athletes for several decades in the combat sports realms or in other realms of, let's say, functional training really weren't doing anything resembling that. They just went on with the conventional bodybuilding training methods that, quite frankly, are inconducive to the world of combat sports. So, what is better? Now, let's take a look at and understand the performances that these two men have had in their recent times. I'm talking about Tyson Fury and Khamzat Chimaev, the two main guys that are the topic of discussion for this particular content. And why is it that I decided I wanted to talk about this is because of the criticism that they both have faced in their recent matchup. The one thing that I have to say about that, and the one important aspect that many people have to really grasp when it comes to combat sports is, once again, I always say it over and over again, it is the theater of the unknown. And when you are dealing with a theater of the unknown, you don't know how the matchup is going to unfold. Which is why, once again, you go back to the notion that George St. Pierre said the greatest of all time does not exist. And let me break down exactly what he means by that. Suppose you are the world champion. You win a fight on a Saturday. You come back to the gym Monday. You do a sparring session. Okay? By the way, let's add some context into this hypothetical story. That championship fight you fought Saturday, you're battered, beaten, and bruised, tired from all the lactic acid that you built up. And by the way, anybody that's competed or has been in the cage, has been in the ring, has been on the mat, or any type of form of competition knows one thing. That the exertion that you have to put on in these types of fights, especially if you go the distance or further rounds down the road, guess what? You're going to be even more tired than you've ever been in, let's say, a 1 or 2 workout session in a day type of situation. Why? Because your adrenaline is pumped high to the max. On top of that, you're nervous, so your central nervous system is affecting the way that you're going about things. So, not to get on the science of fighting and adrenaline and combat and things of that nature, but let's just say you went through all that on a Saturday and you are going on a sparring session Monday. Guess what happens? You could end up getting beat by a guy who's fresh, who, by the way, has a fight coming up in 2 weeks and is somewhat close in his peaking range before he goes into his matchup. So this is the reason why the idea of the greatest of all time does not exist, because you can look great on a Saturday in the world stage where everybody markets it as the best versus the best, and then you come out on top of that particular contest. Now you're crowned the best in the world, but then you got all these other killers in your gym that are as equally good as you, but may not have the notoriety or have not gotten up to the level that you've gotten to yet. So that is the reason why the notion of the greatest of all time does not exist. Another thing that people have to understand about that is this is the reason why some guys just don't look great on certain nights, and then you go and downplay their skills. For all you know, Tyson Fury could literally come back and put it on Usyk in ways that you would have never imagined just based on what you saw in the Francis Ngannou fight. And for all you know, Khamzat Chimaev may just blow Sean Strickland out the waters in ways that you would have never imagined, because he didn't look like that in a Kamaru Usman fight. Now, I know MMA math doesn't work in that particular concept, but you got to understand Usman has a win over Strickland. So is it fair to say that perhaps maybe Kamaru Usman is the better fighter? Well, maybe he was a better fighter during that time era. But what about now? Also, not to take into consideration, maybe Khamzat Chimaev has already gone through the hardest part of all, which is Kamaru Usman. And now he's going to face on an even easier champion than Sean Strickland. You never know. Because guess what? I'm going to leave off with this. Khabib didn't look much in the Al Iaquinta fight when he fought in UFC 223. That was when he had to change opponents because, well, Tony Ferguson fell out. Tony Ferguson had a few injuries. Tony Ferguson had a few of these situations going on. And he was pulled out of the fight during that fight week. They went to Max Holloway. They couldn't clear him. They went to Anthony Pettis. They're like, he's not ranked high enough, even though he was a former world champion. And finally, they went to Al Iaquinta, who, by the way, went to a full 5-round decision against Khabib. And guess what? Guess who was watching this entire fight, sitting in his Brooklyn jail cell after he threw a dolly in a bus? None other than the notorious Conor McGregor. And then he said to himself, this is easy work. I just came off of fighting Floyd, and now I get to go in here and have some easy work in MMA and defend my lineal 155 championship. But guess what? By the end of it all, who looked better? Al Iaquinta or Conor McGregor against Khabib? And we know the answer to that. It was Al Iaquinta. It was just a bad matchup for Khabib.